Does this logic take us to the place where our cats and dogs will be saved?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's because, it's not that I have a text that I can say, here's where Maximus writes about cats and dogs. Um,
You didn't see
how,
this coming.
yeah. However, I will say this. There are a few places I would point to, apart from just his overall, the kind of the flow of his overall vision here. But one at one point he considers whether or not like he has heard there's some people that object to the idea that the risen and ascended Christ has a body. So, and actually, I won't get into the details, but there are some historical precedents where you can maybe we don't have a lot from them, but you can maybe see some people that kind of treated like the incarnation episodically, where it's like, yes, God put on flesh, almost like a coat or whatever, and then he did the thing that transfigured it. That's good for us. Somehow that saves us through the life, death, resurrection of Christ. But the resurrection and transfiguration of Christ, heck, maybe even like the way they maybe would read 1 Corinthians 15, the soma pneumatikos, the spiritual body, maybe that means that the body is sort of more or less discarded. So Maximus considers this and rejects it flatly. And he actually, but what more interesting to me is why. He immediately goes to the very thing I would expect him to go if what we're saying is true, which is that he says, I do not understand how anyone could think the body would be discarded when our God himself has a body now and forever. That's what he says. Eternally. And so that's one little spot in his text, by the way, if anyone's really interested in Big M 42 is where to go there. The other place I would go is to say this. I think it's like an underappreciated sentiment or conviction or principle in Maximus. He says that God never changes his intention or logos, his word or his, that's a complicated word, but he's never changes his intention for anything that he creates, which for him means, this kind of goes back to the plan A thing too. He thinks, and this is a really delicious thing, he thinks that any theology that has God simply reacting to something and say maybe creating or doing something that God didn't necessarily want to do from the outset, like, become incarnate, or like creating an entire world of bodies and physicality of different sorts in order to, like, in a certain picture that's distributed to origins, a little more complicated, but catches these falling souls that have fallen from a primordial unity. God, in response, as it were, creates the world that you know of corporeality, and then catches you, and in order to usher you back through Christ, through divine providence, back to unity with God. Okay. But then that would mean, and Maximus does explicitly target this, he says, but then that would mean God created something that he never intended to. Like, we forced him to do something, make something he didn't want to. And so actually it's in contradistinction. It's in opposition to that Maximus says God creates nothing that he hasn't eternally and always willed to be. And the being he gives it will never cease, because he never wills anything to be that he doesn't want to be eternal. That would be true of literally every creature, including all your cats and dogs and everything else, right? And I think that the notion, mostly in the Thomist tradition, that cats and dogs and stuff are not going to be in heaven comes from a overly, not only, it's not just anthropocentric, but I actually think it restricts the anthropos. It restricts the human being, first of all, to simply the intellect. But of course, what makes us most human isn't simply intellect, but love. And as anybody who's loved a pet knows, just because they don't have the same level of intellect to you doesn't necessarily diminish the value and infinite dignity of the love you have for that animal. But then secondly, in other words, I would say we ought to expand the human more in line with the God human, the incarnation, and to say that what makes us most human isn't just your ability to contemplate ideas, but your ability to love. And so if that's true, then I could say with the Thomist, yes, heaven is nothing but the condition of humanity, but I mean humanity deified in Christ. which encompasses all, including the non-human animals. But then the other thing to say is simply more, maybe even just as importantly, heaven is nothing but God completely deifying and becoming one with everything that he himself loved into being. And it's less about heaven ought therefore to be less about what I perceive as my current limitations in terms of my ascent or progress in the spiritual life, and it's more about the depths of God's canonic and ecstatic love. So heaven is most determined by God's ecstatic and canonic love, not by my human aspirations and inherent limits now on the way to that love. And if that's the case, I just simply see no argument whatsoever for why heaven has to sort of shut out the dogs and cats.